You have the power to protect or to harm, she told them, to build trust or to destroy it. Each interaction, each decision, each moment matters. Choose wisely. The changes weren't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But something fundamental had shifted in the community. People were more aware, more willing to speak up, more committed to making sure that what happened to Mrs. Williams wouldn't happen to anyone else. As Mrs. Williams left the police academy that day, a young cadet rushed to catch up with her. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted you to know. I was in your second grade class 15 years ago. You taught us about justice and standing up for what's right. I became a police officer because I want to protect and serve the way you taught us, with dignity and respect for everyone." Mrs. Williams smiled and straightened his collar, just as she used to do for her students. "Then my work isn't finished," she said. "It's just beginning in a new way." And so, what began as a moment of injustice had transformed into a movement for change. Mrs. Williams still went to church every Sunday, still baked her famous cornbread, still wore her beautiful hats. But now she also carried with her the knowledge that her suffering had not been in vain. It had become a bridge to understanding, a catalyst for change, and a lesson in the power of dignity in the face of injustice. 3 months after that fateful Sunday morning at the pharmacy, Mrs. Williams sat in the front row of the city council chamber. The room was packed with community members, reporters, and activists. The agenda for the day, voting on a comprehensive police reform package that had come to be known as the Williams Act. Mrs. Williams wore another of her church dresses, this one in deep purple, with a new hat that her Sunday school class had given her. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap, but her eyes were bright with purpose. She had transformed her ordeal into something powerful, a catalyst for real change. The civil rights lawsuit she had filed, with the help of a team of dedicated lawyers, had been settled for a substantial sum. But Mrs. Williams hadn't been interested in just monetary compensation. She had insisted on specific reforms being part of any settlement agreement. "Money can't fix what's broken in our system," she had told her lawyers. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The police chief stood at the podium, looking much older than he had 3 months ago. The investigation had revealed deep-rooted problems in his department, leading to several high-ranking officers' resignations. Officers Barrett and Conway had been terminated, their badges and guns turned in. But that was just the beginning. Today, the chief announced, his voice carrying through the packed chamber, "We're not just changing policies. We're changing our entire approach to community policing." He outlined the new measures: mandatory bias training, community oversight committees, body cameras for all officers, and new protocols for responding to suspicious person calls. But the most significant change was the creation of the Community Bridge Program. Mrs. Williams had helped design it herself, drawing on her decades of experience as an educator. The program would bring police officers into classrooms, not just for brief visits, but for regular interactions with students. Officers would mentor young people and, in turn, receive mentoring from community leaders. "We need to know each other as people," Mrs. Williams had explained when proposing the program. "Not as stereotypes, not as uniforms, but as human beings with stories and families and dreams." The pharmacy where the incident occurred had become an unexpected partner in change. They had established monthly community police dialogue sessions in their break room. The store manager had been promoted to district supervisor, specifically to implement diversity and inclusion training across all locations. The young pharmacy technician who had tried to help Mrs. Williams was now leading workshops on being an active ally. "It's not enough to just feel bad when you see injustice," she would tell participants. "You have to be willing to speak up, to stand up, to step up." Mrs. Williams had used part of her settlement money to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing careers in law enforcement. "We need change from within," she explained to a local reporter. "We need officers who understand our community because they come from our community." The first recipient of the scholarship was the daughter of one of Mrs. Williams' former students. The young woman planned to become a police detective with a focus on community relations. "Mrs. Williams taught my mom," she said during the scholarship ceremony. "And now she's teaching all of us that one person really can make a difference." The elderly couple who had witnessed the incident had become regular speakers at police training sessions. The retired judge shared his perspective on how bias can corrupt the justice system, while his wife talked about the importance of speaking up when witnessing injustice. Mr. Thompson, the man whose prejudiced calls had started it all, had been required to attend diversity training as part of a court order. But something unexpected happened during those sessions. He began to listen, he began to learn, and eventually he began to change. "I was wrong," he admitted during a community meeting. "I let fear and prejudice guide my actions, and I hurt innocent people. I can't undo what I did, but I can learn from it and do better." The text messages between Officers Barrett and Conway had become a case study in police training academies across the country. They served as a stark reminder of how bias can poison the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. 1 year after the incident, Mrs. Williams stood in front of a new class of police cadets. She wasn't there to shame them or scold them. She was there to share her story and help them understand the immense responsibility that comes with wearing a badge. A week after the incident, Mrs. Williams' Sunday school class created a special display in the church hall. They collected newspaper clippings, photos, and letters of support from across the country. But the most touching items were the handmade cards from her former students, each one expressing love and support for their beloved teacher. One card, written in careful child's handwriting, captured the essence of the community's response. "Dear Miss Dorothy, you taught us that when something is wrong, we have to stand up and make it right. Now it's our turn to stand up for you." The police department faced mounting pressure to address not just this single incident, but the systemic issues it revealed. The text messages between Officers Barrett and Conway had exposed a culture of bias that could no longer be ignored or explained away. The community demanded more than just apologies. They wanted real, lasting change. The day after Mrs. Williams' arrest, the sidewalk outside the pharmacy transformed into a gathering place for the community. People brought flowers, cards, and signs, creating an impromptu memorial to dignity in the face of injustice. The pharmacy's windows, usually filled with advertisements for sales and seasonal items, now displayed handwritten messages of support. The morning news trucks lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters stood in front of cameras, telling and retelling the story that had now captured national attention. But the real story was unfolding in the hearts and minds of the local community. "I couldn't sleep last night," said one of Mrs. Williams' former students, now a local business owner. "All I could think about was how she taught us to stand up for what's right. She always said that one person's dignity is everyone's dignity." He had closed his shop for the day to join the growing crowd outside the pharmacy. The pharmacy staff had created a special display in the front window. They'd retrieved Mrs. Williams' fallen church hat and prescription slip, placing them on a small table with a vase of fresh flowers and a sign that read, "Standing with Miss Dorothy." The young pharmacy technician who had tried to help during the incident had written a powerful message that was now going viral. "Today, we saw what justice isn't. Tomorrow, we'll show what justice should be." Local churches began organizing prayer vigils. The pastor from Mrs. Williams' church spoke to reporters about her decades of service to the community. "She taught our children more than just reading and writing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She taught them about character, about treating everyone with respect. And now look how she was treated in return." The police chief's initial defense of his officers crumbled as public pressure mounted. Security footage from the pharmacy played on every local news channel, showing the incident from multiple angles. Social media exploded with stories from other community members who had experienced similar treatment from Officers Barrett and Conway. A group of Mrs. Williams' former students, now parents themselves, organized a peaceful protest outside the police station. They carried signs with photos of Mrs. Williams in her classroom, teaching their generation about civic responsibility and justice. Some held up their old class photos, pointing to their younger selves standing beside the teacher who had shaped their understanding of right and wrong. "She taught my daughter last year before retiring," said one mother at the protest, holding her little girl's hand. "When I had to explain to my child why her favorite teacher was arrested, I couldn't find the words. How do you explain this kind of injustice to a 7-year-old? The elderly couple who had witnessed the incident became unexpected advocates for change. The retired judge used his connections to bring attention to similar cases that had been dismissed or overlooked. His wife organized a community meeting at their home, bringing together residents from both sides of town to have honest conversations about racial profiling and community policing. Local high school students created an online petition demanding reform in police training and accountability. They named it the Dorothy Williams Justice Initiative. Within days, it had gathered thousands of signatures from across the country. The students wrote about how Mrs. Williams had taught their parents and how her arrest represented everything wrong with the current system. The pharmacy became an unlikely symbol of resistance. The store manager, who had recorded the incident, turned the security footage over to investigators and spoke out strongly against racial profiling. She instituted new policies requiring any suspicious activity reports to be verified by management before police were called. But perhaps the most powerful response came from the quiet actions of everyday people. White residents began speaking up when they witnessed racial profiling in their neighborhoods. The suspicious person calls that Mr. Thompson had so frequently made began to be challenged by his own neighbors. "We've been blind for too long," said one resident at a community meeting. "We let this happen in our community. We can't just blame the police or one prejudiced caller. We all need to do better." The story reached national news networks and civil rights leaders began arriving in town. They spoke about how Mrs. Williams' case represented a larger pattern across the country. But they also spoke about hope, about how the community's response showed that change was possible when people stood together against injustice. The police chief, initially defensive of his officers, found his position becoming increasingly untenable as more evidence emerged. The text messages were particularly damaging. There was no way to explain away the clear bias and prejudice they revealed. "These officers have betrayed not only their badges," he would later say in a press conference, "but the very community they swore to protect and serve." Their actions reflect a mindset that has no place in modern law enforcement. But for many in the community, especially those who had experienced similar treatment, the chief's words rang hollow. Where was this concern when previous complaints had been filed? Why did it take viral videos and public outrage to address what had clearly been a long-standing problem? The investigation also revealed something that made the incident even more poignant. Among the photos on Officer Barrett's desk at the precinct was a class picture from Oak Elementary School dated 20 years earlier. In it, a much younger Mrs. Williams stood smiling among her second-grade students. Officer Barrett was one of those students, his young face beaming at the camera, unaware that 2 decades later he would handcuff the teacher who had once taught him about respect, dignity, and treating everyone fairly. As the truth continued to unfold, the pharmacy incident became more than just another viral video of racial profiling. It became a mirror held up to the community, reflecting back uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and the long road still ahead in the fight for true equality. Within hours of Mrs. Williams' arrest, the videos began spreading across social media like wildfire. Local news stations picked up the story, showing clips from both cell phone footage and the pharmacy's security cameras. But it wasn't until the internal investigation began that the true depth of the injustice came to light. The anonymous caller, who had reported suspicious activity, turned out to be a man named Mr. Thompson, a resident who lived 3 blocks from the pharmacy. When investigators dug deeper, they discovered something disturbing. This wasn't his first such call. Records showed he had made similar reports 6 times in the past month alone, each time targeting black shoppers in what he considered his neighborhood. "I just want to keep our area safe," he told investigators, his voice steady as if he truly believed he was doing the right thing. The interviewing officer noted how he kept using words like "them" and "these people," never quite saying what he really meant, but making it crystal clear all the same. But Mr. Thompson's prejudiced calls were only part of the story. As internal affairs dug deeper, they found a pattern that made the pharmacy incident look less like an isolated event and more like a symptom of a much larger problem. A young tech-savvy officer in the Internal Affairs Department discovered a thread of text messages between Officers Barrett and Conway. The messages painted a disturbing picture of 2 officers who had been systematically targeting black citizens in predominantly white neighborhoods. Got another one. Read one message from 3 weeks before Mrs. Williams' arrest. "Lady in a fancy dress trying to use the ATM on Oak Street, probably casing the place. These people need to learn where they belong," read another. The messages went on, each one more damning than the last. The officers had been keeping an unofficial count of how many black citizens they had stopped in white neighborhoods, treating it like some sort of game. The investigation revealed more. Both officers had a history of complaints filed against them, but most had been dismissed or buried in paperwork. The pharmacy incident wasn't their first abuse of power, it was just the first time they had been caught on camera, with dozens of witnesses and irrefutable evidence. The store manager's footage showed every detail of Mrs. Williams' arrest in high definition, but perhaps more telling was the security footage from the hour before the incident. It showed Mrs. Williams entering the store calmly, speaking politely with the pharmacy staff, and simply browsing while waiting for her prescription, exactly as any other customer would do. The footage also captured something else. Other customers, all of them white, doing exactly the same things Mrs. Williams had done. Some browsed longer, some carried large bags, some wandered the aisles aimlessly. Not one of them was questioned. Not one of them was approached by police. Not one of them had to explain their presence in the store. When investigators interviewed the pharmacy staff, more details emerged. The young pharmacy technician broke down crying as she described Mrs. Williams' dignity throughout the ordeal. She was so calm, even when they were treating her like a criminal. She just kept asking about her blood pressure medication. She was worried about missing her grandson's Sunday dinner. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything came forward with their statement. The husband, a retired judge, provided a detailed account of the incident. "In my 40 years on the bench," he wrote, "I've never seen a clearer case of racial profiling. Those officers didn't even attempt to verify her story. They didn't want to. Their minds were made up the moment they saw her." Local news stations began digging into Mr. Thompson's history of calls. They found other residents who had been targeted by his suspicious activity reports. A black father taking his children to the community pool. A black teenager delivering newspapers. A black woman jogging through the neighborhood. Each time the police had responded, and each time it had been Officers Barrett and Conway who answered the call. But even as the police car pulled away, something was already happening. The videos were being uploaded, calls were being made, and the truth was spreading. The security cameras had caught everything, and in the age of social media, injustice couldn't stay hidden for long. Mrs. Williams sat straight in the back seat, her handcuffed hands folded in her lap. She began to hum softly, the same hymn she'd been humming on her drive to the pharmacy. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." The words gave her strength, just as they had given strength to generations before her who had faced similar injustices with similar dignity. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer Barrett began to recite Mrs. Williams' rights, his voice mechanical and cold in the tense atmosphere of the pharmacy. Her church hat still lay on the floor, a spot of bright blue against the stark white tiles, next to her fallen prescription slip. The moment felt surreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, while Officer Conway moved to place the handcuffs on her wrists. The cold metal touched her skin, and Mrs. Williams felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. The store manager's voice cut through the tension. "I'm recording everything. This is going straight to the police chief and the local news. What you're doing is wrong." Her hands were shaking, but she held her phone steady, documenting every second of the injustice unfolding before her. More customers had gathered, forming a loose circle around the scene. Their phones were raised like silent witnesses, capturing what would soon become viral footage that would shake their small community to its core. The elderly couple who had spoken up earlier were still there, the woman clutching her husband's arm, both of their faces etched with distress. "Please," the elderly woman called out, her voice trembling. "She's wearing her Sunday best, for heaven's sake. She just came from church." The young pharmacist had finally gotten through to someone on the phone. "Chief? Yes, this is urgent. 2 of your officers are arresting an elderly woman in our store for absolutely no reason. Yes, we have security footage." "No, she hasn't done anything wrong. She's just waiting for her prescription." Mrs. Williams stood perfectly still as the handcuffs clicked into place. She thought about her classroom, where she taught children about the Constitution, about civil rights, about justice. She thought about Martin Luther King Jr.'s words about dignity in the face of injustice. She had lived through the civil rights era, had seen changes both good and bad, but somehow this moment felt like stepping back in time. The store's automatic doors whooshed open as more police cars arrived, their lights flashing through the front windows, casting alternating red and blue shadows across the scene. The morning sun that had seemed so promising earlier now felt harsh and revealing. "Your prescription is ready, Mrs. Williams," called out the young pharmacy technician, her voice breaking. She held up a white paper bag, as if this normal action could somehow break through the absurdity of the situation. Officer Conway started to lead Mrs. Williams toward the exit. She walked slowly, her head held high, just as her mother had taught her. The customers parted like a sea, many of them still recording, others turning away, unable to watch. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a loud whisper, "Why are they arresting the nice lady?" The store's security cameras continued their silent vigil, capturing every angle of the scene. Mrs. Williams' dignified posture, despite the handcuffs, the officer's rigid expressions, the store manager's determined recording, the pharmacy staff's distress, the customer's mix of horror and outrage. As they approached the exit, Mrs. Williams caught her reflection in the store's windows. Her silver hair was slightly disheveled, her Sunday dress wrinkled where the officers had grabbed her, but her expression remained composed. She thought about her grandson waiting for Sunday dinner, about the cornbread she wouldn't be able to make now. Outside, the morning had grown warmer, but Mrs. Williams felt cold. The sidewalk was rough under her church shoes as the officers led her to their patrol car. Passers-by stopped to stare, more phones came out, more witnesses to what was happening in broad daylight at the corner pharmacy. "Watch your head," Officer Barrett said mechanically as he guided her into the back seat. The words seemed like a cruel parody of courtesy after what they'd just done. The police car's interior smelled of artificial pine and stale coffee. Through the car's window, Mrs. Williams could see the store manager running out, still on her phone, still recording. The elderly couple had followed too, the husband writing something down, probably their contact information for when this all went to court, as it surely would. As Officer Conway shut the car door, Mrs. Williams heard the pharmacy technician's voice one last time. "We'll keep your prescription ready, Mrs. Williams. We'll hold it for you." The car's engine started, and Mrs. Williams watched as the pharmacy grew smaller in the rear window. She thought about all the times she told her students that things were getting better, that America was moving forward. Now she wondered what she would tell them about this day. The young store clerk who had tried to help earlier was now openly crying, their hands shaking as they continued to record the scene on their phone. An elderly white couple who had been shopping nearby approached slowly. "We've been here the whole time," the elderly man said, his voice shaking with anger. "This lady hasn't done anything wrong. We're witnesses. You're making a terrible mistake." More customers had gathered at the ends of the aisles, their faces showing a mix of shock, anger, and helplessness. The store's cheery background music seemed to mock the gravity of the situation, playing an upbeat tune about love and happiness while an innocent woman was being treated like a criminal. Officer Barrett's grip on Mrs. Williams' arm tightened. "Last warning, ma'am. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, or we'll have to use force." Mrs. Williams closed her eyes briefly, saying a silent prayer. When she opened them, she looked directly into the security camera above, its red light blinking steadily. She knew that somewhere, somehow, the truth would come out. It had to. The store manager was now speaking rapidly into her phone. "Yes, I need to speak to the police supervisor immediately. We have a situation here with 2 of your officers. No, this can't wait. They're about to arrest an elderly woman for absolutely no reason." Mrs. Williams thought about her students again, all those young faces she'd taught over the years, all those lessons about right and wrong, about standing up for what you believe in, about maintaining your dignity even in the face of injustice. She had always told them that the truth would prevail, that justice would win in the end. Now, standing in that brightly lit pharmacy aisle, surrounded by witnesses with their phones held high, she hoped she had been right. The vitamin aisle had become unnaturally quiet. The only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional crackle of police radios. Mrs. Williams could feel her heart pounding, but decades of experience in challenging situations had taught her to maintain her composure. She'd faced discrimination before, but never quite like this. Officers, she began again, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she'd used to calm countless schoolchildren over the years. I understand you're doing your job, but I'm simply a customer waiting for my prescription. The pharmacist can confirm this. Officer Barrett stepped closer, his shadow falling across her face. Ma'am, we've had reports of people casing this neighborhood, looking for opportunities. His tone suggested he'd already decided she was guilty of something. You match a description we received. The store manager tried once more to intervene. Officers, please. I've been watching the security cameras all morning. Mrs. Williams came straight to the pharmacy counter and has only been browsing while waiting for her medication. There's absolutely no suspicious activity here. But Officer Conway was already reaching for his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously as he pulled them from his belt. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, he ordered, his voice hard and cold. Mrs. Williams felt her knees go weak, but she stood her ground. Please, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. My prescription slip is right here in my purse. I can show you. I said turn around. Officer Conway's voice echoed through the store. A child in another aisle started crying, and their mother quickly hurried them toward the exit. The young pharmacist was now on the phone, speaking urgently into the receiver. The store manager had pulled out her cell phone too, recording everything. Several customers had their phones out as well, the cameras capturing what everyone could see was a grave injustice unfolding. I taught for 30 years in this community, Mrs. Williams said, her voice trembling slightly but still dignified. Some of my former students are police officers now. Please just check my ID. Call the pharmacy counter. This is completely unnecessary. But the officers weren't listening. Officer Barrett grabbed her arm, causing her to lose her balance slightly. Her church hat, the beloved gift from her former students, fell to the floor. The prescription slip she'd been holding fluttered down beside it, landing face up on the clean tile floor. The store manager's voice rose in protest. This is absolutely unacceptable. She's a respected member of this community. You can't treat her this way. She moved forward, phone still recording, but Officer Conway blocked her path. Stay back, or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business, he warned, his hand still on his handcuffs. Mrs. Williams thought about all the times she taught her students about justice and fairness. She thought about the conversations she'd had with her own children about how to handle situations like this. Stay calm, don't resist, live to fight another day. She thought about her grandson, who was expecting her famous cornbread at dinner tonight. My blood pressure medication, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. I really need to pick up my blood pressure medication. The store manager appeared from the back office, drawn by the commotion. She was young, probably in her early 30s, and her face showed a mix of confusion and concern. Officers, what seems to be the problem? This is a regular customer. But the officers weren't listening. They were focused entirely on Mrs. Williams, their postures rigid with unwarranted suspicion. The security cameras continued to record as the situation spiraled further out of control, capturing every moment of what would soon become a viral symbol of racial profiling in America. I have my church program in my purse, Mrs. Williams said softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades of similar experiences. And my prescription slip. I'm just here to pick up my blood pressure medication. The officers exchanged a look that made Mrs. Williams' stomach tighten. She'd seen that look before, the look of people who had already made up their minds about who she was and what she was doing there, regardless of the truth. The store's background music had shifted to another oldies tune, the cheerful melody now a surreal backdrop to the tense scene unfolding in the vitamin aisle. The morning sunlight streaming through the front windows created long shadows that stretched across the floor, marking the passing of time in this moment that seemed frozen. Little did anyone know that this incident would soon spark a nationwide conversation about racial profiling and police conduct. But for now, Mrs. Williams stood alone in that aisle, surrounded by bottles promising better health and longer life, facing a situation that would test every ounce of her dignity and strength. Inside the pharmacy, Mrs. Williams headed straight to the prescription counter to drop off her slip. The young pharmacist greeted her with a warm smile, checking her information and letting her know it would be about 20 minutes. Feel free to look around while you wait, she said kindly, her nameplate catching the fluorescent light above. The store was quiet for a Sunday morning, with just a handful of customers browsing the aisles. Soft music played overhead, an old Beatles song that reminded Mrs. Williams of her teaching days. She decided to look at the vitamin section, thinking about what her doctor had recommended during her last checkup. Her grandson had been insisting she take better care of herself, especially since she lived alone. As she studied the labels on different multivitamin bottles, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The automatic doors at the entrance slid open, and 2 police officers walked in. Their boots made heavy sounds against the polished floor, and their radios crackled with static-filled chatter. Something about their purposeful stride made Mrs. Williams' hand tighten around the vitamin bottle she was holding. Officer Barrett was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed to perfection. His partner, Officer Conway, was shorter but moved with the same rigid authority. They didn't stop at the counter or speak to any staff members. Instead, they walked directly toward the vitamin aisle where Mrs. Williams stood. The store's security cameras would later show what happened next in painful detail. Mrs. Williams was simply reading the back of a vitamin bottle, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, when Officer Barrett's voice cut through the store's quiet atmosphere. "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" His tone was sharp, nothing like the community-oriented police officers who sometimes visited her classroom to talk to the children about safety. Mrs. Williams looked up, startled but maintaining her composure. "Good morning, officers," she said clearly, her teacher's voice steady despite her rising anxiety. "I'm waiting for my prescription to be filled." She gestured toward the pharmacy counter, where the young pharmacist was watching the scene unfold with growing concern. "We received a call about suspicious activity in this store," Officer Conway said, positioning himself at the end of the aisle. His hand rested casually on his belt, close to his weapon. "Someone matching your description." Mrs. Williams felt her heart racing but kept her voice calm. "I've only been here for a few minutes. I came straight from church, as you can see." She smoothed her dress self-consciously, the fabric familiar under her trembling fingers. The young store clerk who had been arranging displays earlier stepped forward. "Officers, she's a customer. She's waiting for her prescription. I can verify." "Step back," Officer Barrett commanded, cutting him off. "This is police business." The clerk retreated, but pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Can I see some identification?" Officer Conway demanded, moving closer. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression even more intimidating. Mrs. Williams reached for her purse slowly, very slowly, remembering all the conversations she'd had with her own children and grandchildren about interactions with law enforcement. "My ID is in my wallet," she explained, keeping her movements deliberate and visible. "I'm just going to." "Stop." Officer Barrett's voice boomed through the store. "Keep your hands where we can see them." The few customers in the store had stopped what they were doing. An elderly white couple near the greeting cards looked on with horror. A young mother pulled her child closer, whispering something in his ear. The pharmacist stepped out from behind the counter. "Officers, there must be some mistake. This is Mrs. Williams. She's a retired teacher. Her prescription is being filled right now. I can show you." "Stay behind your counter," Officer Conway ordered. "This is an ongoing investigation." Mrs. Williams stood perfectly still, her hands visible at her sides. The vitamin bottle she'd been holding sat forgotten on the shelf. She thought about all the times she'd told her students that police officers were their friends, that they were there to protect and serve. She thought about the lesson plans she'd written about community helpers, about respect and dignity. The automatic doors slid open with a gentle whoosh, and Mrs. Williams stepped into the cool, air-conditioned store. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the smell of newly stocked shelves and cleaning supplies filled the air. She pulled her shopping list from her purse, determined to go about her business with the same grace and dignity she'd carried throughout her life. The soft morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of Pine Grove Baptist Church as Mrs. Dorothy Williams gathered her belongings after another uplifting Sunday service. The gentle murmur of conversation filled the air as church members lingered, catching up on the week's events and sharing warm embraces. At 68, Mrs. Williams was a fixture in the community, her presence as reliable as the church bells that rang every Sunday morning. She smoothed down her powder blue floral dress, a favorite she'd worn countless times before, and adjusted the matching hat that sat perfectly atop her silver-streaked hair. The hat was a gift from her former students, given to her 5 years ago at her retirement celebration after 3 decades of teaching second grade at Oak Elementary School. Those students, now grown with children of their own, still called her Miss Dorothy whenever they saw her around town. As she made her way down the church steps, several young children ran up to give her quick hugs. Their parents smiled and waved, remembering their own days in her classroom where she taught them not just reading and arithmetic, but also kindness and respect. Mrs. Williams had a way of making every child feel special, no matter their background or abilities. "Miss Dorothy, are you coming to the bake sale next weekend?" called out one of the church volunteers, holding the door open for an elderly couple. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied with her characteristic warm smile. "I'm bringing my sweet potato pie, the one with the secret ingredient." Her sweet potato pie was legendary in the community, and she never revealed her secret ingredient, not even to her closest friends. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the sweet scent of blooming magnolias. Mrs. Williams decided it was too beautiful a day to head straight home. She needed to pick up her blood pressure medication anyway, and the new pharmacy that had opened in the neighboring area had better prices than her usual drugstore. As she walked to her well-maintained 2005 Toyota Camry, she thought about how much the town had changed over the years. The neighborhoods were still largely separated by invisible lines of race and class, but things were slowly improving. The new pharmacy's opening in the predominantly white Oak Ridge area was a sign of progress. In the past, she would have had to drive an extra 20 minutes to get her prescriptions filled. Mrs. Williams hummed a hymn as she drove, her fingers tapping gently on the steering wheel. The drive was pleasant, past neat rows of houses with well-manicured lawns and children playing in their front yards. Some residents looked up as her car passed by. She was still a rare sight in this neighborhood, despite living just 10 minutes away for the past 40 years. The pharmacy parking lot was half full when she arrived. Through the large front windows, she could see the neat aisles stocked with everything from greeting cards to household supplies. A young man was arranging a display of seasonal items near the entrance, and the pharmacy counter at the back had a small line of Sunday morning customers. Mrs. Williams checked her watch. It was just past 11:30 a.m. She had plenty of time to browse a bit before heading home to prepare her Sunday dinner. Her grandson was coming over later, and she wanted to make his favorite cornbread. She reached into her purse, making sure she had her prescription slip and insurance card ready. As she stepped out of her car, she caught her reflection in the window. The sun made her silver hair shine beneath her hat, and she straightened her dress one more time. Her mother had always taught her to present herself with dignity, no matter where she went. "You represent not just yourself," she would say, "but all those who came before you." Little did Mrs. Williams know that this routine Sunday errand was about to become anything but ordinary. As she walked toward the pharmacy entrance, she noticed a police cruiser pulling into the parking lot. It wasn't unusual to see police cars in this neighborhood. They patrolled here frequently. Still, something about the way the officers were already watching her made her heart beat a little faster. She took a deep breath and held her head high, just as she'd done thousands of times before when faced with subtle prejudices and suspicious glances. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered to herself, a prayer that had carried her through many difficult moments in her life. She had no way of knowing that she would need that strength more than ever in the next few minutes.